morning, everyone. Welcome to the Marx School, Baruch College, and this first 2019 issue of the Marx Issues Forum. We're delighted to see you here. My name is David Birdsell. I am the Dean of the Marx School of Public and International Affairs. Thank you, sir. Thank you. And I am delighted to welcome a distinguished panel to address a really critical question, not only in higher education, but in philanthropy overall, and that is the ethical dangers of politically motivated philanthropy. And of course, we are going to be focusing today on higher education. Just a couple of words of context before I introduce our panelists, whose full biographies you'll find in this morning's program. Philanthropy in higher education is a big deal. In 2017, which is the last year for which we have complete figures, over $43 billion of private money were raised in support of higher education. Now, the large majority of that money goes to institutions that are already reasonably well heeled. Over $10 billion of that went to just 3 institutions, to Harvard, to Cornell, and to Stanford in the course of that year. But a great many institutions participate. There are 5 publics represented in the top 20 list, and an increasing number of institutions predicate their ability to deliver courses, hire faculty, do things that we need to do for students on private philanthropy. That's not to say, however, that all private philanthropy is created equal, raised in exactly the same way, or has the same set of implications for institutional integrity, and particularly, I know we'll hear it a lot today, the issue of academic freedom. So here to talk about that today is a marvelous panel with a couple of people who have been at ground zero of one of the larger controversies in the higher education universe. James Finkelstein, to my far right, emeritus professor at the Schar School of Public Policy at George Mason University. Jim has had a variety of roles in higher education at a number of institutions, including administrative roles at Schar and at there's a university just to the south of here around Washington Square. It's NYU. And he has been there, so welcome back to New York, Jim. It's welcome to have you here. And I should note, just for the record, that Jim began his career as a public school teacher. So always important perspective to bring to the higher education enterprise. To my immediate right is Judith Wildy. She is the Chief Operating Officer of the Schar School. She has had as well a number of roles, ministerial and otherwise, in higher education. She is a member of the Schar faculty. She has been a member of the University of New Mexico faculty, and she has also worked for the accreditor of the accreditors, the Council on Higher Education Accreditation. So whenever any of us are responding to accreditation, say, those people have all the power. Not true. Chia has all the power, and Judith has been there right at the epicenter. Thank you.
But don't hold it against me.
We shan't. We shan't. Even though we're right up for our Middle States decennial accreditation, and we'll be asking for something under the table later. And finally, in the middle of our 2 guests from Fairfax is Michael Seltzer on the Marx School faculty. Michael has had a long and distinguished career in philanthropy and other arenas. He's been a program officer at the Ford Foundation. He was president of what is now Philanthropy New York, then the New York Regional Association of Grant Makers. He has extensive experience in Africa and in other nations, supporting AIDS services and research, and a number of other areas. He is with us as a distinguished lecturer, and he will provide some broader context on these important questions. So welcome to all of you. It's great to see you here this morning. Jim, I wanted to start with you. As we've noted, this is a very large endeavor in higher education, but it sometimes runs off the rails with what is widely perceived to be undue donor influence. Can you talk a little bit about the scope of the problem and about how that problem comes to pass?
Well, let me give you a specific example. When I was the vice dean of the public policy school at George Mason, we had a faculty member who sadly passed away at a young age, and he held the Koch chair in international economics. He had happened to transfer from the economics department to our school when he passed away. Of course, we said, well, we have a new endowed chair in the school that we're going to fill, but I wanted to see the donor agreement. This was in the late 90s. And so I went to the development office, got a copy of the donor agreement, read through it, and there was a line in that donor agreement that said that the Koch Foundation would have a representative on the search committee. Took me a little bit by surprise. Mason really didn't have a big history of philanthropy, not like Ohio State or NYU that raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So any money was important there. I took the donor agreement to the senior faculty and asked them to review it, and the faculty were adamant. We either renegotiate that donor agreement or we give the chair back to the university and let this be someone else's problem, which is exactly what we did. So this agreement went back to the early 90s at Mason. Contrary to some people thinking this controversy just started at Mason. The Koch influence started back in the late 80s, early 90s. And that influence has been pervasive. In the recent lawsuit by Transparent GMU, which is a group of students who sued the university and the university's foundation to make the Koch agreements public, the university said, we don't have any of these agreements. They all belong to our foundation. So they made that argument at the courts. The court said, we agree with you. The university was dismissed. Arguments went forward. But lo and behold, before the judge issued his ruling, the university said, oh, we just found a bunch of these agreements. Over $50 million worth of these agreements. Of course, now it's too late. I mean, the case has already been argued. And that led to a whole bunch of stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post last year about these agreements, and really brought this controversy to a head. So those agreements, according to the president of the university, all of which were signed before, of course, he became president, said these contain terms that are unacceptable. And that started a whole process this last year at Mason of review of all donor agreements, new gift acceptance policy that's under review right now. We can talk about that a little bit later because I don't think it really solves the problem. But this particular group at Mason, the Koch Foundation, and there are other foundations that participate with them in funding primarily the law school and the economics department, have had a lot of influence at the university over the years. And I think most people, when they think of George Mason, they think often of the economics department and the law school, and Mason as being a conservative university. Judith can talk more about what it really is, because she's still there. But that's sort of how, so this goes back a good ways. And the university is still struggling with it today, whether or not donors, in particular this group of donors, should have the kind of influence they do in not just the law school and the economics department, but across the university.
Okay. Judith, let's go to you next. And thinking certainly of George Mason, but of other universities as well. Jim mentioned that there was a Koch gift. In 2019, the name Koch sets off flashing neon signs. In 1998, probably not so much. Is it just a problem of a small number of donors, and does it tip toward one or the other end of the political spectrum, or is this a more pervasive problem in your view?
I'd say it's probably more of a pervasive problem. When you look at the literature, which we did in preparing for this, Education Dive has listed just recently the 9 trends in higher education for 2019. The first one just happens to be that capital campaigns will be getting much more ambitious. And by that, they mean huge campaigns. We used to say $100 million. Wow, that's really ambitious. Not anymore. Harvard currently has a $9.6 billion, that's with a B, campaign. Michigan and the University of Washington both have $5 billion campaigns. Down to $3 billion, only $3 billion for the University of Florida. So I think one of the other issues here is it's not just private universities, it's not just public universities, it's both of them. During the last academic year, there were at least 32 gifts that we could identify in excess of $50 million. Some people have started actually referring to this as philanthrocapitalism. As all one word, philanthrocapitalism. And what they say about this is that, yes, billionaires are willing to give away their fortunes, but they're not willing to give away their power. So that's one of the issues. This number 2 trend that Education Dive identified is that many of those gifts will come with strings. Jim mentioned one. I'll mention a different university, University of Wisconsin, which accepted $100 million from the electronics maker Foxconn to create an interdisciplinary research initiative. $100 million, fairly broadly based, it sounds really great. Except there are 3 little strings attached to this. One, it has to be 100 miles away from Madison, Wisconsin. 100 miles away from the university. It just happens to be near the future home of a Foxconn plant. And number 3, the university has to match that in order to get the full amount. $100 million is not easy for a university to be able to match. And then you add the newest twitch to that, is that there's some question about whether Foxconn is going to build that plant or not. So if they don't build the plant, what happens to the gift? So we get all kinds of entanglements here. So I have more to say, but I'll let you ask some other questions, the other panelists too.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Michael Seltzer for a moment. Michael, we have a serious supply and demand problem here.
Yes.
Charities need support. The people who are in the best position to give that support are people who have very deep pockets. Can you talk a little bit about, in historical context, this notion of donor influence on activities, and bring that back, if you could, toward the question specific to higher education?
Thank you, David. My first foundation job was in 1969, and for foundation watchers, that was the year of the Tax Reform Act. And before 69, of course, not of course, but sadly, there was no required payout, and that was where we ended up with a 5% payout. As a native New Yorker that grew up in the heyday of the Broadway theater, there was a performer, Peter Allen, that used to say, "Everything old is new again." And I think that puts a historical context on the discussion today. If we think of the wealth that accumulated in the late 1800s that led to today's modern foundations, and some still ancient foundations, I should say, that also is, universities, of course, in this country, predate foundations by 300 years. I love your Harvard story because the mention, because we shouldn't forget Harvard was started by a collection of books by John Harvard, and that's a small comparison to where it is today. So when I mean everything is old is new again, John D. Rockefeller, when he created the Rockefeller Foundation, had this interesting idea. He says, "I want to have our foundation chartered by the U.S. Congress." And it was the heyday of him giving out dimes on the streets of New York and wherever he was. And the U.S. Congress, in the height of Ida Tarbell time and the controversy around the robber baron wealth, said, "Are you crazy?" basically, and denied John D. Rockefeller a charter. He then had to go to Albany, and it seems that the New York state officials were less worried about the associations that John D. Rockefeller had and was chartered in New York State. So the notion of wealth, whether it be individual wealth or corporate wealth, has been with us a long, long time. I think what's different now is that it's come to a point where there are more instances of it. There's greater transparency, greater accountability, the internet, and also the politicized environment. So I think what we see now, from my perspective, is more confluence of these issues than we ever have had seen.
Thank you. Jim, I wonder if you could give us a sense of how much of this, again, we've got $43 billion on the table. It's an enormous sum of money, washing across over hundreds of institutions, if not thousands of institutions. So not all of that is concentrated in one place, although 10 billion of it is concentrated in 3. What proportion of that funding, and I'm not going to hold you to a number because I think that's hard to do, but how much risk is there in that enormous portfolio writ large? And how would you understand the nature of the problem in terms of a proportion of that very big tab?
So I don't know, it was a number of years ago, the Chronicle of Higher Education did an analysis of conservative gifts from conservative sources to universities in the United States. And George Mason ranked third. But the first two universities that received more than George Mason were Harvard and the University of Chicago. Huge endowments. George Mason has essentially no endowment. I mean, it's like $50–60 million. I mean, it's nothing. So if you give $1 million or $2 million to Harvard or the University of Chicago, you're not likely to get much for your money. You give a couple $1 million to an institution that, like George Mason, you can get a lot for your money. So in 2016, I think, or 2017, 16 or 17, Koch donations overall were about just under $80 million from the Charles Koch Foundation, not all of which goes to higher education. But when you give large amounts of money to some of the institutions where that they've targeted, like George Mason, Chapman University, you can, that's a strategic investment. I mean, I like Judith's comment. Billionaires are willing to give away their money, but not their power, not their influence. There's a lot of influence to be bought. When you do it at a place that's located in the nation's capital, or some would argue, a capital, one of the capitals of the world, and you do it strategically, you can accomplish a lot. I was saying to the provost, and people at breakfast, George Mason has been the largest supplier of presidential appointees to this administration of any university in the country. And in fact, there are some people who say that more George Mason faculty have been appointed to this administration than typically are appointed from Harvard in a Democratic administration. That's a lot of influence. We can talk later. I have some specific numbers I can talk about the kinds of money we're talking about at George Mason, which are pretty fascinating that you really don't see in the press. But there's about 30%, between 30–35% of the money donated to George Mason comes from Koch and other groups. A lot of it isn't for the benefit of the university per se, it's for the benefit of something called the Mercatus Center, which is its own 501c3, its own independent charitable organization that's affiliated with the university but not part of the university. But the university support is responsible, the university's foundation provides 85% of the support for Mercatus. So there's some sort of, I don't want to use the word, I regret using the term money laundering, but there is some recycling of these monies among these organizations that's difficult to understand unless you really, really drill down deep into the numbers.
Getting to your point about the modesty of some of the investments, I rocked myself to sleep last night reading the now disclosed gift agreements. It will get you to sleep, trust me. But I had noticed that some of those chairs were being sold for as little as $900,000 over time. It was which is our advancement team is with us today, far below what we would accept for an endowed chair. And just, I was interested in that relationship, and we can come back to that. But let me ask this question. Is this primarily a question of conservative influence or of political influence that could arise from anywhere on the spectrum? If a Tom Steyer or if somebody else identified with strongly liberal causes, also with $1 billion in the bank, were to give, to endow professorships, fund research centers, whatever it is, would we have the same level of concern? Michael?
In the 1990s, when I was at the Ford Foundation, we used to, in my circles, they're categorized, a funder, are they a buyer or are they a builder? Or are they both? And the distinction was that a buyer is using almost a grantee as a vendor to provide a certain service, could be reducing the incidence of teenage pregnancy or, in today's Ford jargon, reducing signs of inequity. A builder is one who wants a twofer grant, which is saying we want to move the needle on that issue, but we also want to strengthen the organization. and it's a closer relationship to that we would like to see. And I think both. This might be controversial in some sense, but I think both sides of the political spectrum, you would find examples of both. I personally abhor those who are simply buyers, because it's a disservice to the organization, because one-year funding is not going to make a major difference. And anybody seriously looking at the kinds of issues that we look at in our society, no, we're not going to move the needle that much in 12 months. And we need also to keep the electricity going and so forth. But general support funding is still, I'm sad to say, which is the mother's milk to most organizations, the needle on that has not moved at all, although we still have institutions like Ford Foundation that believe in it strongly.
So, Judith, thinking not only of George Mason, but of higher education more broadly, there is a widely held belief, whether accurate or inaccurate, that colleges and universities are bastions of unquestioning liberalism. And what I know many of these donors are after with their gifts, I'm arguing against type here, gang, but trust me, this is something we need to talk about. That many of these donors would argue that what their gifts do is to make some small inroads to right the imbalance, and offer students and offer the research community broadly a more balanced set of perspectives across the political spectrum. How do you, as a chief operating officer, respond to that? Again, not solely within the Mason context, but within the kind of fiduciary obligations you exercise in your role.
Well, one of the issues that I think arises here is the recognition that we've all had to come to, at least at public institutions, where in the past, the state legislature has provided the majority of the funds. That's no longer the case. Most universities, and I'm not speaking Mason in particular, but most public universities, if they see a third of their funding coming from the legislature anymore, that's a huge amount. It's typically much less than that. So one of the issues is they need the money. Where did they get it? So in a way, it doesn't matter which side, they're just looking after money. I will say that there are places where a lot of these donations are hidden in some ways. One of the donors to the Schar School itself specifically asked that we put the whole donation agreement on the website. He wanted everybody to see it. I think that's something to look for is the transparency issue. Right. The more willing they are to be transparent, I would say the more potential to be a builder. That's what they want. Actually, in looking at some of the literature, we're finding four kind of themes, four things that we need to look for in the gifts or to be aware of as we look at gifts. One of them, as Jim kind of hinted at, is the threat to academic freedom. Whether it's on the liberal side or the conservative side, is there some sort of threat to academic freedom? We've seen a lot of this, lot of threats to academic freedom lately. Jim and I do a lot of research looking at the use of search firms in the hiring of presidents. And more of those are becoming secret searches where nobody is allowed to say anything. And finally, at the end, there's sort of the rush of the trumpets, and here is our new president. That can be seen as a threat to academic freedom as well, but these kinds of donations can add to that. Another is the threat to the reputation. As Jim said, Mason is seen as a very conservative university now. There are some departments, some schools that are that way, but it does not mean that the entire university is. But if you start taking a certain type of money, be it conservative or liberal, you get branded one way, and that may cause you problems in getting other types of money. So there can be that issue. Another is risk of being dependent upon these gifts. To some extent you are, but are you dependent on a particular gift? We've seen universities who have accepted monies where they're required to hire so many so many faculty members. Well, what happens when that money gets out? It's no longer being gifted, but these faculty members are tenured. And the university still, for potentially many years, is going to have to fund them. That's another idea. And then the last one I've already mentioned is the lack of transparency. So those are 4 things I think you can look at within any gift agreement. See where do they range on the schedule, continuum, and whether you want to accept that or not, whether it's conservative or liberal.
Michael?
I want to pick up on Judith's excellent point about reputation. I believe probably a lot of you in the room are familiar, but may not be, with the Pew Research study that was released last year about the image of public opinion about higher education. And I should add, Pew Research is actually part of a foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust. And the headline that was, "Most Americans say higher ed is heading in the wrong direction." But partisans disagree on why. And what was particularly interesting was they broke it down by Democrats and Republicans. And they discovered that there was truer about Republicans, but it was surprisingly high among Democrats as well. So the question that is a really pressing question on the terms of this discussion is, how much are these issues affecting public opinion of higher ed in particular? And we don't know the answer to that, but we know if we were in the corporate sector, they would have a tremendous number of metrics indicating about how their brand is affected when a scandal happens.
And we know from that very same Pew study that the reason that so many Republicans are skeptical of higher education is that they believe that it's completely captive of liberal politics.
Yeah.
Right.
And I want to pick up on the transparency point. So one of the things that happened in response to the transparent GMU lawsuit, this group of students, was that the Koch Foundation has now said they're going to be more transparent. They're going to uphold certain core academic values. So I actually, it's easy to say things. So I actually went back and looked at their website over the weekend.
This is the Koch Foundation.
This is the Koch Foundation website. So their commitment is to make all major multi-year agreements publicly available.
Right.
So they have 3 years of those agreements up, 2016, 17, and 18. There are 14 agreements. That's it. And the numbers are really, really pretty interesting. Those gifts are worth a little over $77 million for the life of the gifts. And the gifts range from being paid out over 2 years to being paid out over 10 years. If you go back and look at the tax forms for the Koch Foundation and look at what they paid out in the most recent year that's available, which is 2016, on those gifts, they paid out $1.2 million. They paid out that entire year $78 million. So they're being transparent about 1.5% of their gifts. So I'm not certain, what is transparent about that. But when you examine those gift agreements, a couple of things come out that I found, fascinating. Anybody in here do philosophy of science? I did early on in my academic career. There's language in these new gift agreements. And just let me read it to you. I mean, it's just a sentence. Consistent with the donor's principles of supporting open inquiry and diversity of ideas in higher education, the donor's grant is intended to promote a republic of science at the university where ideas can be exchanged freely and useful knowledge will benefit the well-being of individuals in society. Sounds like mom and apple pie, right? Mm-hmm. The key there is the phrase Republic of Science. Republic of Science is the title of an article by he became a philosopher of science, originally trained as a physician, then got his PhD in chemistry, a guy named Michael Polanyi. And if you go back and if you read that piece from 1962, it has pretty heavy overtones of a very libertarian view of the value of scientific ideas in society. It's very Darwinian. That it's all the best ideas, will always win out, and you should not do anything to restrict those ideas. I don't know if your provost here, ever read that little piece from 1962. Probably so, given his background. But I don't think there are many university presidents, and probably none of the advancement staff here would recognize those code words. But those are in all Koch agreements. So in signing that agreement, you're signing on to their idea. The other thing that's interesting about these agreements, these are gifts, supposedly, but they're not. They really operate more like grants or even contracts, because they all have termination clauses in them that say, we're only going to give you your gift every year, and we're only going to give you next year's gift if we like what you did last year, and you have to submit that to us for our review. That's not philanthropy, at least not in the world that I know.
Right.
Now, the Ford Foundation might revoke a grant because someone did something really horrible, but there's an assumption that with a gift especially, we're giving this to you without a lot of strings. So if you go back and read these agreements and you look at the termination language in it, it's as complex as what Judith and I see in presidential contracts today. It gives the donor an enormous amount of influence over what's going on in the university.
So, Judith, you began giving us a sense of ways that we can be prudent about this that would allow us to continue to harvest revenue. And are we all agreed, by the way, that we need philanthropic revenue to run colleges and universities in the current environment?
We become dependent on it in new ways than we have been historically.
Largely because of the erosion of support that Judith described, yes.
That's the excuse that's given. I'd argue that it's also the way that presidents keep score today, and it's how they advance their careers. So there are lots of entangling interests here about the nature of philanthropy and higher education.
Well, I hadn't expected to go down this road, but let's just stay right here for a minute or two. So we know, if you're on the public side, that state support year over year is declining in all 50 of 50 states in a 40-year rolling average. Right. We know that federal support in block grant form that moves to states is declining year over year in a 40-year rolling average. We know that the number one source that we've turned to plug that bleeding gap is not philanthropy, but is student tuition, right? And students are paying more and more. And one of the other reasons in the Pew report that Michael referred to, that people are uncertain that higher education poses a solid value proposition for America, is that students are paying a greater portion of their own or their family's assets to get to college. So is it better under that environment? And let's just stipulate that we can't wave a wand and get our public officials to invest more in education, and particularly on the public education side. If we're not going to philanthropy, do we just soak the students more?
Or do we ask the questions that some ask, are we spending our money wisely, as efficiently and effectively as possible? Our research, our other research on university presidents, if you look at what's happened to the university presidency and the cost of administration in universities over the last 20 years, I mean, the curve is like that.
Sure.
You
It's
look
not
at
a curve, it's a...
right. You look at faculty salaries, it's about like that.
Right.
There are a lot of areas where costs of universities have run out of control. So there's a balance here. And if you're going to have philanthropy for what? A couple of examples. When I was at Ohio State planning the first capital campaign, there was a gentleman by the name of Alex Schoenbaum, Shoney's big boy. He had been a football player in his day at Ohio State. He wanted to donate $1 million to Ohio State, which back in 1981, 82 was real money. But he wanted to donate it to the athletic department, to build a practice facility for the football team. Everybody here knows football, big deal, Ohio State. We had a decision to make, right? Get $1 million gift, big news, but it supports a group of, a very small, group of people and has nothing to do with the academic mission, of the university. We were fortunate. We came up with a solution. We said to Alex, you can donate that money, but you got to raise $1 million for scholarships for non-athletes. which he gladly did and was successful in doing that. I don't know how much that happens today, but it's philanthropy for what?
Right. Of course, the apotheosis of that story is Phil Knight in Oregon, but we can talk more about that.
And I think another thing is, though, we're getting to the point where it's not just this type of philanthropy being found in higher education. It's moving down. We found at least one case, but one that I noted, a $25 million gift from the CEO of the Blackstone Group to his high school, which again sounds nice, except that it was a 21-page gift agreement, which right away in my mind, when you see that long a gift agreement, you know there are many strings attached within that. He had in there that the high school would be renamed after his family, and that different parts of it would be named after a brother, an old track coach, and so on and so forth. The school district was willing to do all that, and were so willing that they waited until one day before they were meeting to vote on it to announce any of this. A minor public outcry, just a minor one. But to me, the interesting thing is out of that is that they ended up accepting the gift with compromises. I couldn't actually find what those specific compromises were, except that the school kept its name. Other than that, it's down into high school, and we can name others. You know, I know of others where that has happened as well. But I think, again, we come back to the idea of transparency. And we did find a study, an actual empirical study with data, where somebody looked at transparency, among other things, but went to GuideStar. GuideStar.org is a great way to find out about virtually every philanthropic organization in the country, every 501c3. They have a sort of a grading scale where they say if you provide the basic information, you're considered basic. If you provide a little more, they give bronze, silver, and gold. So they took that as how much, as a measure, a metric of how much did these organizations reveal about themselves and what they provided to GuideStar. And what they actually ended up doing was a very sophisticated multiple regression. Okay, my last degree's in stats, so I enjoyed reading this. But a multiple regression analysis where they accounted for a lot of the variance. But the final outcome really is that the more transparent these organizations were, the more likely they were to get contributions that they could pass on. So that the transparency is not just for those of us who are receiving the final money, but it's for those organizations that are giving it as well. And I think that's something to remember too. Although looking at it, when he put these organizations into 10 categories, the least likely to be transparency was the category of university.
Mm-hmm.
Michael.
I'm just thinking that there is no Middle States accreditation for foundations. If we're talking about universities and foundations, I mean, foundations, the interpretation of charitable in all, state and federal documents is so broad. You know, it would take an Olympic swimmer to get through it, to see how much variation there is. Foundations are very wary of regulation, and because they're concerned about the politics of the time. If you wanted me to say, would I want to see legislation passed during this administration focusing on foundations, I would say absolutely not. But another major distinction is the question of stakeholders. I mean, we think of the stakeholders in the process in universities. As a member of our faculty senate here, we have universities have an incredible number of internal and external stakeholders. Right. And so one of the issues I think is worth addressing is the process where internal processes that we use at universities to come to some agreeable position that is going to satisfy the most important stakeholders, which is hard to exclude any of them.
And that's one last thing before we go to the questions. I mean, this is sort of inside baseball, but most public universities don't accept gifts directly. They accept them through their associated foundations. And these are almost always separately incorporated 501c3s with their own boards. And there's a real debate going on in the courts these days about whether or not those organizations are subject to the open records, freedom of information laws of particular states. So the current ruling in Virginia is that they're not, although it's on appeal. But the Supreme Court in Kentucky recently decided that they are subject to open records requests, that they are actually part of the universities. The recent IRS put out some guidance on excessive compensation for nonprofit executives a couple of weeks ago, and there's even language in there that suggests that they view these organizations as part of the universities. But because the universities and the foundations generally take the position that they're not, there's a lot of monkey business that goes on there. That unless you've been inside it, both from a university administrator and a fundraiser, most people won't see. One example, in the new gift acceptance policy at my former institution, which is just about to be approved, there's a line in there that says they have all these conditions of certain kinds of gifts that are subject to review by this new committee. Except that the person who determines whether or not a gift is going to be reviewed is the Vice President for Development and Alumni Relations. And there is no reporting on the decisions that she will make, either, even post hoc.
And no appeal.
And so if she decides that, my gift to my old school that's going to require them, that clearly violates these standards, isn't going to be subject to review because her bonus is dependent upon, meeting the fundraising targets for the year, guess what? We'll never know that. So there's a lot of work, especially, I would argue, that faculty have to do, and the media has to do, to hold people like me, who were administrators all of my academic career, accountable, because left to our own devices, nothing against the dean or the provost here, we have all sorts of other pressures on us.
Yes, that's right.
There are absolutely no unseemly pressures at Baruch College. So I want to get to the very good stack of questions, by the way. Thank you very much, everyone. One of our questioners wants to know about the existence of either requirements or disallowances of gifts that presume a public policy norm, such as affirmative action. Does that make a gift off ground, that all money spent in hiring toward this gift shall conform to principles of affirmative action or something of that sort?
I think that, I guess I'd put it another way. I mean, a gift that that said that you had to hire a particular kind of individual, intellectually, on basis of gender, on basis of race. I mean, just in a public university, it'd just be like, I would assume, the scholarship debate, that you can't have those restrictions, but I don't know that it's been tested.
Yeah. There's a related example, Harvey Weinstein. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that term, that name. There was a public university on the East Coast and a private university on the West Coast that will go nameless that had to deal with the receipt of gifts from Mr. Weinstein after the news came out of his sexual activities. And they both diverged in their response. The private university received $5 million from Mr. Weinstein for a program named after his mother to support women in the film industry. And it was the public university in the East received a gift, much smaller gift, to support the women's programming. The public university accepted the gift or didn't return the gift, and the private university rejected. And we could say the argument, and by the way, the private university got much more publicity, maybe in the size of the gift, God knows what it was. the public university received very little notice in the media about it. It only appeared in one of their state newspapers, and this is a very complicated issue because the public university said this is going against everything he has stood for, he has represented, and so the two stories raise a fascinating question about decision making in this process, and also who was involved in the decision making. The public university, as far as I could detect, did not have stakeholders involved in the decisions, such as the women's programs that would have been affected. And so it's a fascinating example of what's going on.
But it's the hiring issue of faculty that has been the third rail, right? I mean, and that's, and Mason has had to deal with that because some of these former gift agreements required the hiring of specific individuals. Yeah. We've said we won't do that again, but as Judith said, we have a long-term liability now in terms of the financial obligation of the institution to continue to pay those people.
Right. Okay. And we will skip right over the irony of Harvey Weinstein investing in women's careers, but we'll get there later. One of our questioners has a question about an issue that we have talked about here, which is that the idea of endowments in perpetuity is less and less a priority to donors. New donors increasingly want to see impact and results during their lives. Does this also compromise academic or institutional autonomy and freedom by moving a short-term agenda as opposed to a long-term agenda?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I would say it's an equal problem, whether it's an endowment or what's referred to as current use money. It depends on how the gift agreement is written. And so it comes down again to the transparency issues, to all the things we've talked about. But I don't see that the current use money has any less potential to be a problem than the endowments do.
It's interesting because there's been a change here in the last 10 to 20 years. I mean, it used to be at a university, in order to name a professorship, you had to endow it. That's no longer the case. I mean, many universities will accept a couple $1 million up front as current use money to hire the individual initially, to hire someone initially, and then that's someone else's problem 5 years later. The same would be true for other kinds of naming gifts for buildings. But donors, you're right. The questioner is right. Donors today, I mean, Koch doesn't give endowment money. They give current use money. So when they named the law school, the Kochs and this anonymous donor at George Mason as the Antonin Scalia Law School. I think you all know what it was called before. It was called the Antonin Scalia Law School. It's the Antonin Scalia School of Law. Just figure out what that acronym is, and you'll smile in a second. All that $30 million is current use money, over 5 years. But interestingly, the family of Scalia, the grandchildren, so the document's written so that the family retains the ability to take back the name of the law school through the lifetime of the youngest grandchild, who was 18 years old at the time of the gift. Long time out there, right? And it's not clear whether all the grandchildren have to agree, or there's who knows. So they got $30 million, but they retain they still own the name. They're only loaning it to the university, but for a very, very, very long time. No one really talks about that in this particular gift, but that to me is one of the more egregious aspects of that gift.
And of course, the flip side of that is what recently happened with Avery Fisher Hall when David Geffen trotted in with a 10 times larger gift, and now we no longer have Avery Fisher Hall. We have David Geffen Hall.
Yeah.
So they're
facing David Koch Hall.
Facing David Koch Hall. That is exactly right. One member of the audience has posed a hypothetical. This individual wants to establish a $100 million endowment. By the way, we're going to hold you to this at the end of the program. And on one of two programs, a women's studies program to promote the education and advancement of women, or a men's studies program to promote or advance the education of men. It's not negotiable. Which one of these do you accept and why?
I think this is a clear gender issue.
I-
I find this fascinating, a historian of our field. Women tend not, past and today, women tend not to put their names on their foundations. Commonwealth is Anna Harkness. New World Foundation is one of the McCormick family. Even Abigail Disney today, her foundation is called the Daphne Foundation. It's not called the Abigail Disney. Now, there are exceptions like Lori M. Tisch. And I think who we've been referring to all day are men. You know, who have, and I'm not qualified enough to get into questions of the difference of the sexes on these issues, but clearly the men are the greater offenders of these issues in confronting them than women donors have been. So I would suggest the money be going for women's studies.
So so there was a case that I dealt with where a donor wanted to support. Wanted the university to adopt a particular curriculum in a particular area, and my view is off limits. Now, if a faculty member has an idea for for a new major or new curriculum in something and wants to go around and support it, and it goes through the curriculum review process of in the school, whatever the faculty councils are at the university, that's different. But when donors start coming in, and you see this more in elementary, secondary education than you have seen it in higher education, where big money comes in and says, we're going to have a new curriculum in STEM, that if you just do this, we're going to solve the STEM problem. I think that's that's a problem, especially for higher education. I think that's an abridgment of academic freedom.
And can you sharpen that? And one of the questions from the audience is, I still don't see a problem here. What's the issue if somebody puts the thumb on the scale for hiring? Let's take it with this idea of developing a new academic area, and we certainly have at this very institution, for example, area studies programs like Latin American studies, et cetera, which. Those are good things to have. STEM studies programs might be good things to have. When would we recognize a hard foul in that kind of donor?
Well, I mean, I think it's where the idea comes from. I mean, really, I mean, if a you have a donor that has a passionate interest in developing let's say a particular program on substance abuse, and has the cure to the opioid crisis, and wants to start a new program at Baruch for public health professionals, to address the opioid crisis, but you got to do it their way, and they're going to prepare everything, and they're going to give you $100 million to implement that program. They're going to have a say in who the faculty are. They're going to have a say in who the students are. They're going to have a say in what's taught, how things are evaluated, how people are certified. That seems to be the antithetical to the core values of the university and its faculty. If they want to set up an institute, they want to set up their own organization to do that outside that. But the core values of universities are what seems to me we need to protect from being eroded in these cases. And money is very tempting.
Oh yeah.
I mean, this issue at Mason this last year, if you read the Times Higher Education Supplement from January, there's an article about George Mason, and there's a response from the president of George Mason to the Koch money there. And the president's very clear. He's trying to figure out a balance on how to continue to accept this money without getting the faculty so upset that they're going to start marching on his office.
Last question. One individual wants to know if the gold standard for donation should be anonymous, no strings. And so I'd like you to respond to that issue, but more broadly, assuming that private philanthropy is not going away from higher education, public or private, anytime in the foreseeable future, how should we best protect ourselves and the values of the university in soliciting this kind of revenue? And we'll begin with you, Judith.
Okay. I'd say that, first off, the two most important things that I would say to look at is the effect on academic freedom in any particular gift, and also the idea of transparency. The one donor that I mentioned earlier who actually asked that his full agreement be put on the website, that's about as transparent as you can possibly get. And it's there for everybody to see. I've had people come to me related to the law school at George Mason saying, I don't know whether I want to go there because it's got an 8-foot statue of Antonin Scalia in the lobby. What do you think that says about it on top of where the monies have come from? And that one was not very transparent. I have copies of some of the gift agreement, partly because we were negotiating one at the same time, and I wanted to see what are the pros and cons of each one, and how could I compare them. But I think there is a gold standard, and I think for me those are the two top things to look for and try and measure.
Thank you. Michael?
I agree there's a gold standard. It was written by Maimonides in the 15th century, where he said anonymous giving was the highest form of giving. Unfortunately, since then, it's kind of gone in decline. I mean, and I think it's, I don't know if we can tie it with Maimonides not being taught sufficiently. I see one person who knows about his 10 steps, but I think we do need to remember also that philanthropy has its origins in our great religions, and to think through what the full message, not just the message you should tithe or you should give, but the Maimonides 10 different levels of giving, and I invite you all to look it up if you haven't seen it, is a wonderful precept for today.
Thank you. Jim,
Yeah,
last word.
I agree that anonymous giving is important, but it's hard to be anonymous when you're giving $1 billion to a university, like it just happened, with Michael Bloomberg and Johns Hopkins.
Well.
So in that sense, I think there has to be transparency and accountability on behalf of the beneficiaries of those monies, because there is just too much of an opportunity. Higher education is not immune from corruption and controversy. We see it all the time. I mean, Judith and I get a call every week about some university president somewhere getting in trouble about something. And what does that mean in terms of whatever? So I think that we have to become more transparent. And I would say, again, even though I spent most of my life as an administrator in universities, faculty have to be more engaged in these processes and not leave it to those of us who sit in the administrative offices to determine what counts as transparency, how these monies should be used, what should be supported. If we don't, this is a real area that's not well developed or well explored in shared governance in universities. I was the first elected faculty representative to our board of trustees, we call it Board of Visitors in Virginia, the development committee of our Board of Visitors. There had never been one before 5 or 6 years ago. All the development stuff happened in executive committee behind closed doors. And you know what? When it came time to discuss the major gifts, the two of us who were the faculty representatives were asked to leave the room.
Can I add a point to Rich?
Yeah, real quickly.
We do have a wonderful example who is no longer anonymous, but that was not due his own doing, of anonymous giving in today's world, and that's Charles Feeney, who created his Atlantic Philanthropies in Bermuda so he wouldn't have to go through the rigmarole he thought of registering in the U.S. And he was identified when he sold, his fortune was from duty-free shops. He started the first one in the world. And he was only identified, he had to come out as a philanthropist. And one of his major recipients is interesting, is Cornell, where he helped fund also the campus here on Roosevelt Island. So he a proud Irish American, but a very modest man who I don't know if he was exposed to Maimonides, but so we do have donors still among us that are, for a variety of reasons, are remaining anonymous.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful conversation.